Let me just yell.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Baltimore Museum of Art. We are so excited to have you all here with us this evening. I'm Cecilia Wickman. I'm an associate curator in the Contemporary Department here at the BMA and co-curator of the exhibition Histories Collide, Jackie Milad, Fred Wilson, and Nekisha Durrett.
Good evening, folks. I'm Dave East. I'm the former Director of Public Engagement here at the BMA, and I'm also the co-curator of the exhibition Histories Collide. After this evening, for the rest of the year, we invite you to experience the exhibition on view in the John Waters Rotunda and the Jacobs Galleries again and again through March 17th.
So on behalf of Dorothy Wagner Wallace Director, Asma Naeem, who is, as you know, very much here with us in spirit, though Asma is traveling on museum business right now. We welcome you all to what promises to be an exhilarating conversation, a true meeting of the minds between three artists who have spent the last year turning over a shared question. What new images and thoughts emerge when myths and histories collide? So collision and juxtaposition, what happens in the space of connecting, of linking together?
In this spirit of open inquiry, we are thrilled to welcome to the stage artist Nekisha Durrett. We can do some.
Yes.
Jackie Milad. And Fred Wilson. Rather than list their innumerable accomplishments now, we encourage you to spend time after you've heard their conversation, delving more deeply into their stories online and in your library. What you will hear about tonight and what you will see in the galleries is just one piece of their very, very in-depth stories.
And so moderating tonight's conversation, being the glue, in her words, is Lisa Corrin, Ellen Phillips Katz, Executive Director of Northwestern University's Block Museum of Art. Woo! Yes. So as many of you know, as founding curator of the Contemporary and organizer with George Sissel of Fred Wilson's Seismic Mining the Museum in 1992, Lisa holds very deep connection to this project's DNA.
As we turn it over to Lisa and the artists, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the jury, our partners in realizing the exhibition, who have taught us so much about prioritizing care for connection and learning in place across generations. Angela Carroll, Terry Henderson, Ashley Minner-Jones, Ginevra Shea, and George Sissel, our esteemed advisor, who has nurtured all of us and all of our potential in this undertaking.
We thank the sponsor of this exhibition, the Dorman Mazroff Contemporary Endowment Fund. Thank you, Stan and Nancy. Yes. And Karen Reiner, whose generous extended loan and stewardship of Artemis Bast has made this undertaking possible. And to close us out, Dave.
This program is produced in partnership with the Winston Tabb Special Collections Research Center at Johns Hopkins University. Afterwards, we invite all of you to join us for our conversation, the Q&A, and a reception in Fox Court so that we can connect, celebrate these artists, and the work that's on view today. Thank you.
Well, I just want to start by saying it's a real honor to have been asked to come back to my adopted home, Baltimore, to celebrate not only the work of these extraordinary artists, but such an important step for the Baltimore Museum of Art. I don't know how many of you realize what it means for a large museum like this to yield power not only to the artists, but to the decision makers from the community to make the choice of which artists would be asked to create new work in response to this remarkable loan of the Fred Wilson work that really sets the whole ball in motion. And I think it's really important that we take a moment to acknowledge the Baltimore Museum of Art and how it is becoming increasingly an artist-centered museum and really nourishing the artists who live in this great city, of whom there are many. And let's just take a moment to applaud the BMA. So the way our conversation is going to work this evening is that we're going to start off with Fred. We want to sort of take a moment to go down memory lane to an earlier moment in Fred's career to talk a little bit about the work of art that is on loan to the Baltimore Museum of Art, and from the original installation in which it was part, to ask him what he was thinking about at that time, particularly because it was very much about histories colliding. And I'm going to start here, and for those of you, in case you haven't been to the John Waters Rotunda to see it, this is Artemis Bast from the installation Pantaray that was originally at Metro Pictures Gallery. I want to just get it up a little bit closer so you can take a good look. It is a plaster cast, not one made by the artist, but like so many of his works, it's a found object. And as you can see around the base, what looks like shattered fragments, both of the white figure, but also the head of Bast, an Egyptian god, poking its head out from over that beautiful wet drapery of the toga. So a cat's head on a goddess's, on the body of the goddess of the hunt. Fred, let's talk about Pantaray as an example within your many bodies of work of how histories collide. What are we looking at here?
This project was inspired by two different things. One was my trips to Egypt. The other was the book by Martin Bernal, Black Athena, which kind of, I had my own thoughts about what was going on in historic times, and certainly how it was framed. But he sort of wrote the book on, literally wrote the book on the situation. And I was very profoundly intrigued by things that seemed to make sense. The notion that the relationships in that area of the world, especially between Greece and Egypt, were brought forth and sort of fabricated by the West rather than the histories, the actual histories of those regions and those relationships made because of that.
So we have here a figure of Atlas standing on a history of African art.
Those are all my art history books.
Those are your art history books.
I'm really glad to get rid of them.
And this, this piece reminds me so much of my own art history training.
Oh.
First of all, I should say that at my college, there was no non-Western or non-European art taught, and that was very common at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And so African art, I never studied African art in either undergraduate or graduate school. It wasn't offered, they weren't faculty, which I think is really notable. So I had what I would call the traditional training in which it was the West and the rest, to quote Stuart Hall. And it was also about the Greco-Roman tradition being primo and everything else following from that, okay? Egypt was considered it was compartmentalized as an entirely separate part of art history, so never the twain did meet. In addition, the fact that Egypt was part of Africa was never discussed. Okay? This installation, Pantarei, was in many ways a critique of my education. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh.
Not personally, of course, but
Yeah.
collectively.
Yeah, right.
Many of us in this room of a certain generation.
Yes. Yeah, this one, I don't remember the title of this exhibition was, when did I put this together? I don't even remember. It's been
I don't know, 92,
92.
93, something like that.
So my memory is like, spotty. But anyway, this is obviously a Greco-Roman figure with a cartouche or the Egyptian lettering and writing on ancient Egyptian lettering on this figure, because even when I was there, you could find shards in the sand of ancient things. I really wanted to kind of at least acknowledge that the Egypt and the rest, as was stated, was co-opted by Europe and framed the way so that they were sort of the important figures in the discovery of this historic art. So the majority of the works are just these combinations that expressed my feelings about the problematic of the West and Egypt. Next.
The histories that collide are not just, in your case, the histories of the Greco-Roman civilizations and Egypt, but also art histories and ways of framing these moments and ways of framing period. Do you want to talk a little bit, just before we turn it over to Nekisha and Jackie, about the idea of the collision of history in your work?
Well, that's the other thing. Certainly in the piece that's on view, I really wanted to emphasize, in not actual terms, but really the way, visual terms, to make this collision very clear and obvious, and try to stop people in their tracks to sort of think about why I would make something like this and how it reflects to me not about European history and in relationship to Egypt, but also what the average person retains in their mind about that relationship, and so by bringing them together, I want people to sort of be able to think about these two related deities and whose narrative, just changing the narrative as that is normally spoken about, these two, that the connection between them is not really discussed. And to do this is really not about, the decapitation of Artemis. It's really about who, a physical sculpture that brings that question to the fore. My works are not endings, they're sort of beginnings, and they're to kind of think about why, reframing and rethinking about the histories and how they were intersected, but also how we have made them, how should I say, changed how those relationships to suit an audience.
I'm going to jump to Jackie, because there's a way in which, if I may, Fred, you had to break it to repair it. And it feels to me like in the work of these two artists, Well, they've taken on, without any question, how histories collide. They're in the exquisite beauty of what they've created. There is a kind of repair and healing going on. There's the opportunity, right, by asking those big questions to then recast it, if I may continue the metaphor of the plaster cast. So let me just turn to you, Jackie, if I could, and ask you, and you heard the title of the exhibition, and you had an opportunity to think about the collision of histories, and you looked at Fred's work. How did you approach this, and how did you arrive where you did? And I want you to know I'll be showing you images of each artist's works. If you haven't seen the show, you'll get a little preview.
Wow. So last night I revealed an obsession that I have with Fred Wilson's work, and I'll say that first. I think it was early when the museum, the BMA, opened up to after lockdown. There were opportunities for folks to come through the museum on timed basis, and Piero, my son, and I came through, and we went directly to the contemporary wing, as I do. And I was surprised to see Artemis Bast was installed in there, and had no idea that Fred's work was on loan here at the museum. And I said to Piero at that very moment, this work, I want to show my work next to this work. And
a very personal reason for that.
Yes. So I think for a very long time, before I can even, remember any other form of education, history was something that I was taught by my family, the history of our heritage and the history, social political history of the countries that my parents are from.
Your father is Coptic Egyptian, and your mother is Honduran.
Correct. And so, really trying to understand, through research, like literally, like as a child, reading, had very lucky to be able to go to museums and spend a lot of time with museum collections from those two places. And what I realized is that history is very messy. Once you start digging, it's messy, it's chaotic, it's incredibly layered, textured, and of course there's a lot that we don't understand. There's stuff that we do understand, but it is a very complicated topic.
Actually, Pantarei, if I'm not mistaken, is a quote from Heraclides,
Yes.
which means everything's in flux.
Also,
which
yes.
really comes across in your work.
Exactly. Yes, so Pantarei's that idea is very important to me for sure. So yeah, I wanted to really try to, and I think that that's something that I'm continuously very much, excited by, this idea of creating historical documents and making these works as complicated and overwhelming, as messy and chaotic as history is. And I think there is a lot to be said about this idea of evolution and recreation in the work, because this history is nonstop. It's everywhere, it's all the time, right?
Can't we say, you use the image of the snake a lot, and the snake is often a symbol not only for chaos,
Correct.
The chaos of history, one might say, but also the sort of constant loop of time, right?
Yes.
Never ending,
Exactly.
never ending. So
Exactly.
in a way, that's what the writing of history is, because it's never fully written.
Correct, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things about your work that if I may say, just jump in here,
Please.
I want to make sure that you all in the audience, because you're reading it in slides, you can't even begin to see how layered this work actually is. Let's just take 1 minute, if I can, to like move from your family heritage and your study of Egyptian and ancient art, Coptic art,
Yeah.
but also to like talk about the technique and how the technique itself embodies this idea of collision, because it's a collision of a lot of different materials, from beading to amulets, charms,
Yeah.
made with your father, who was a goldsmith,
Yeah.
to collaging. Let's just talk about that technique
Sure.
as a kind of metaphor for this exhibition theme.
So this is a practice that I've had for some time, where I use work, older work that I cut up and recontextualize into newer work, and so it's a constant evolution. So I think of these pieces and works that I make as paused as opposed to finished, per se. So there's this, I will go back into a piece in the studio while it's being produced, cut it up, and maybe repurpose it and mix match. And so there is this constant thing that's happening with, so let's say these come back to the studio, that it will happen again.
When is the work finished?
What's that?
How do you know when the work's finished?
That's what I mean. I feel like that is a part of the process of, really trying to capture how history feels, and this never-ending kind of push, so that the work isn't static. It doesn't end up in an archive and, collects dust, but it is an object that will continue to have, inform the next layer or
It
the
has
collage.
a life. It's a living being.
It's a living being.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things about if I can just kind of point out a couple things to the audience that is really struck me when I worked in the room for the first time. It's a very dark room. It's very theatrical. The use of the fringe, they almost become like theater curtains about to be lifted. The work also looks to the tapestry in the medieval room. So a work that is not intended to be a textile becomes one, and it sort of drapes in a quite exquisite way. So at a certain point, when you get up close, you realize the layering, but from a distance, it becomes something else entirely. Yeah. When I saw the reproductions before I'd come to Baltimore, I actually thought they were paintings. So, because the space itself is very, very flat, and the way you play with space is very painterly. And you're also, by the way, just an extraordinary colorist, if I may say. It's something that one doesn't want to overlook. But I do think that the technique that you've evolved over time, and folks, if you haven't also seen it up in the contemporary wing, there's another gorgeous work acquired by the BMA, by Jackie, that's actually made on a coverlet that was owned by your aunt. And again, that idea of personal history and even the materials being part of your own, the archive of your life, which really, so it's the kind of collision or intersection of your history with these bigger histories that are part of your DNA. Right.
And if I may just add one more thing to what you're saying, there's so one of the things that I realized going to this is perfect actually, going to museums as a child. So my parents would take me to the museum, the Met here, the Walters, and my father very often would say, "This is your heritage," this Egyptian collection, at the Met, for example. And my reaction usually was, I don't see it. I don't see the connection. I don't see how this is related to our family. Because of course, a museum is not messy, it's not chaotic, it doesn't have the layers, there's no collision happening at museums for good reason. I didn't have that kind of relationship, that I didn't see it. And so, like, fast forward to October of this year, in preparation for this work, I traveled to the British Museum and was able to spend time one-on-one with objects of antiquity from Egypt, this being one of them, a funerary mask. Yeah, so you know, I'm also just to point out that I'm taking notes, but I'm drawing these objects. And this process of drawing objects is very personal, and it's like creates a relationship. I was surprised by how emotional that experience was. So I took these drawings, brought them back to the studio, did a digital print of them, and so you see this and other objects are included. It's sort of like a repatriation of these objects into the work and into my story.
Later on, we're going to get into some of the issues around repatriation, because it's a very, very important one for you. You also went to Egypt,
yeah,
to Cairo.
Right. So
this is the mosque, yeah?
Yeah, so this was in 2020. This is a really important, so if anyone has seen me do an artist talk, like this is an image that I often show. But this is a really important experience for me, because this is one of the oldest, still in use, religious sites in the world. This is Luxor Temple, and it literally, you can see history on the walls, layered in collage, in three-dimensional collage. So there's the pharaonic temple, but this layer right here is a Coptic church, and then on top a still in use mosque was built on top of the church, and then inside, yeah. So inside of the temple, the pharaonic temple, are Roman frescoes, and so this is like an incredible way to, three-dimensional way to see history. And then, of course, you have tourists and language and all of, McDonald's and rap music and all of the things that are, surrounding you, and it's cacophony.
My favorite building in Rome is San Clemente, because
yes.
You've been there?
Yes, of
right?
course.
So there's a Mithraeum on the ground floor.
It is.
Fred is nodding because he was living in Rome. And then you have the Romanesque church.
Exactly.
Then you have the Gothic church. Then you have some, bastardized version of Gothic and Renaissance all kind of smushed together.
I love that.
And they have the transparent steps where you go down into these layers of history, and you realize that, underneath our feet, whether in the United States, where from time immemorial, Native peoples, their history is literally under our feet.
Correct, yeah.
To these extraordinary historic sites,
Yeah.
that everywhere we step in the world is an archaeological site containing many people's histories, and they're always in collision with each other.
Yes.
But they also flow through us, quite literally. It's our historic DNA, you might say. So I want to turn to, if I may, these are just some of these wonderful pictures of the works being produced, but, and there you are, the scale is just really quite extraordinary. But now I want to give Nekisha an opportunity to tell us about how she approached the theme of Histories Collide. And starting with some gorgeous installation shots. I have to warn you all, if you haven't seen Nekisha's piece yet, again, these were the images that were sent to me before I came, and absolutely nothing prepared me for the scale of your work, and how it would affect me physically when I went in the room. It's a work that is it's about interiority, and yet you access that through a very visceral and participatory kind of experience.
I wanted to first start by saying that last night at dinner, I discovered, or we discovered, that our paths actually collided back in the 90s at Cooper Union, and you were teaching there, and I was a student, and never were you my teacher there, but I do feel like I have been your student. So I just wanted to say that. I think that there comes a point in my process, at least I think in my most successful works, when I feel like, you know, there's you know, this idea that there's always kind of music playing in artist studios, and along with that, I feel like is your body of work that I always kind of return to as sort of a as a measuring stick. One of the things that I think that you do so brilliantly is to strike this balance between the poetic and the literal, which is something that I'm always striving toward. Frontier is I think that the idea for Frontier came about as I was laying on my studio floor on top of a panel that was soon to be a portrait, a commissioned portrait of Harriet Tubman for a foundation in Delaware. At that time when I was approached by this foundation, they had seen a portrait that I made of James Baldwin that was made of these sculptural halftone dots that came together to make his likeness. And so they said, we want that, but we want it to be Harriet Tubman. And that is like the worst thing you could ever say to me, because I don't, you know, I just, I like to sort of, you know, take on new challenges with every project, and especially think of, you know, unique ways to approach portraiture. And I said, does it have to look like Harriet Tubman? And they said, yes, it absolutely has to bear her likeness. So I started thinking of ways that I could sort of have how I could approach this portrait in a different way. And so I started thinking about what I knew about Harriet Tubman, what I didn't know about her, and when I learned what I know about Harriet Tubman. And so I thought about when I was a very young girl in elementary school, in public schools in Maryland, and thinking about, you know, Black History Month, when we all learned about Harriet Tubman. And, you know, the story of Harriet Tubman was reduced to one line. And as I grew to know more about who Harriet Tubman was, it wasn't until much later when I actually realized that she, like me, was from Maryland. And so at that point, it occurred to me to go to sites in Maryland that were specific to her history. And I found myself at a church, and then I found myself collecting soil from this church, not knowing quite what I was going to do with this soil. And eventually what I ended up doing was making a pigment out of the soil and rendering a photograph of Harriet Tubman, which everyone has seen. There aren't that many photographs of Harriet Tubman. And so I rendered this photograph in halftone dots using soil from this place. And so it was a very, you know, there were hundreds of thousands of these halftone dots that made up this image. And so it was a very time-consuming process. And I think artists deal very well, I think, with the passing of time and also spending time alone. And so I listened to a lot of audiobooks while I was making this work.
Actually, can I just jump in and say, it sounds like a very meditative process.
Yes.
And also one that took you from the literal image inside of yourself. I mean, it was like very emotional for me to hear you describe this process. Mm-hmm. And I was just kind of imagining that process of then moving from the image and the material
So
beginning to think about who she really was.
Yeah. And so I think that as a former educator, I'm always trying to think of ways to make history come to life for my students. And so I was thinking, like, wow, what a missed opportunity for my elementary school teacher to not mention that the very same soil or similar soil that we were playing on outside at recess was similar to the soil that, that Harriet Tubman, that she led her friends and family members to safety and freedom. Like, that just would have been a beautiful connection, which is what led me to the soil. But I'm sitting there and I'm listening to Harriet Tubman's biography as it is being told to a white woman, an abolitionist, but a white woman of her time, who describes Harriet Tubman's mind as being ignorant and dark. And so it was those words that kind of like, it stopped me like dead in my tracks. And I kind of held on to that. Thought about mining the museum, which we'll get to later. Thought about those pedestals, those empty pedestals for Harriet Tubman, for Frederick Douglass, for Benjamin Banneker. All Marylanders.
I want to make sure everybody here, even though it's farther ahead, I just want to make sure everybody here knows what you're referring to. So in Fred's, in his Mining the Museum exhibition, it's the first thing you saw, the Truth Trophy surrounded by empty black pedestals, white pedestals with three white Marylanders who had nothing to do with Maryland history, three empty black pedestals with the names of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Benjamin Banneker, none of whose were represented in the Maryland Historical Society collection.
And so, again, here is this poetic way of demonstrating absence. Which would eventually lead me to, there was another line in this biography where Harriet Tubman describes having a dream where she's flying over the landscape in its darkness, and off in the distance she sees a white line. And what comes next is what I perceive to be this white woman sort of injecting herself into the narrative. And she says that Harriet said that she saw these beautiful white women with flowers, extending their hands across the line, and Harriet was trying to reach the line, but she couldn't reach the line. There's so much here. So I imagine this white line. Also, at the time, during the pandemic, or maybe before the pandemic, I learned of this poet, David Whyte, who is Welsh and Irish, everything that I'm not, to my knowledge. And he has this poem about darkness. And there's a line where it says, the night has eyes. The night has eyes to recognize its own. And we were talking last night about what happens when light skin is reflected in this black mirror, and when black skin is reflected in this mirror. And what sort of happens is that the black skin sort of gets absorbed into the blackness, and white skin sort of sits on top.
That's something that Fred has done with his the Murano glass mirrors in the works about Othello. I actually asked Tracy Beal, who's the head of public programs, to stand next to this work with me. She is black, so that I could actually physically experience that. And not only to see myself become black, but also to think about
historic empathy, because in looking at this work, well, first of all, I want to say something about the horizon line, because it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think about when Harriet Tubman was liberating her father and her brother, and your work, the soil in this piece comes from the Mount Pleasant Acres plantation, where they and Harriet Tubman also were enslaved, but that she had to keep her eye on the horizon at all times and inside of her, and that horizon line is straight, and it gives the piece stability, and one can imagine that she internalized that line because that's what kept her balanced.
Yes.
So that she could do what she did time and time and time again with those dogs barking at her heels and not knowing whether the people in her care would be safe. But also, one imagines in looking at this work her deep spiritual life. So this is not just a piece about the courageous acts, which we all read about, even in grade school, but about what it takes to do those acts, what kind of character, what kind of moral determination, and what kind of spiritual evolution in a human being to actually do that. And in being in the room, I felt it was almost, I use the word religious, it's not really what we're looking for here, I don't want to use that word, but it was a deeply spiritual experience, because it's also like a giant inner eye.
Yes.
And that the simplicity of the work also reminds me of Buddhism. And I think of, the role of light in Buddhist thought. But also there's a kind of, in that simple comparison of the black and the white, and also what happens to the body as the horizon gets higher and higher over your head, the closer you get.
Yeah.
You begin to reflect on what you're doing visually. It has a way of sort of lifting you literally in the arms of the work, and it's really quite spectacular. And
I think there's a lifting, and I think there's also sort of there's a pull toward it, and thankfully there's only been one handprint situation. A very small child toward the bottom. It was very cute, in a way.
Here is here is some of the dirt that you collected. You had to get special permission to do that.
Yes, I had to get special permission from the stewards of this land.
And this is the land.
Yes, this is the land. This is
and this is the tree.
That shot was a small garden that was on the property, and this is the tree from around which most of the soil was collected. This is a tulip poplar tree, and just by there are a lot of things in the making of the work. The scale of the work, I tend to lean toward large. My work tends to be scaled up, and in some ways, sometimes the scale of the work, the size that the work can be, is determined by the parameters of the material. And so in this case, I kind of maxed it, figured out what is the largest size of this black reflective material that I can find, and then I kind of scaled it from there. But the really amazing thing that happens, and I have to go back to what you were saying about the spiritual, one thing that I did not plan was that this piece is about the exact circumference of the poplar tree. This, where the soil was collected, and the significance of that poplar tree is that it is the same tree that was standing when Harriet would return to this site time and time again to free her family members. And before they would set out on their journey, they would hold hands in a circle around the tree and pray.
We are at time, but before I move to questions, and I thought we might talk a little bit about how the legacy of mining the museum. But actually, what I'd rather do, if you don't mind, before we go to a few questions from the audience, Fred, I'd really like to bring you into the conversation if I could, because, and I thought, Nekisha, what you said about Fred's work being like music in the back of your head, we often hear people say, oh, that artist was so influenced by that. And what I think what you've seen this evening is that this is not about influence. It's about the way artists and their works have conversations with each other over time. And how one generation looks at, in this case, the collision of histories in one way, but then how subsequent generations, where they take that in ways that we could never have predicted. So this is not about how do I make something like mining the museum, but how are the bigger messages in Fred's work about history, how have you taken them in, and how they've intersected with your own personal histories, and how you see history, and emerged in these two extraordinary bodies of work that were commissioned by the BMA. And so, Fred, before we go to the audience, the question I have for you is, what's it like to see this happen? Wow, you've got these youngsters who, but truly, your legacy the legacy of your work and of the many relationships you've built over years in this city, it does continue to have a big impact, not only on what artists make, but also what they learn. For example, the Maryland Institute College of Art and curatorial classes and art history classes. I mean, there's a reverberation that goes back, from the time that your very influential work was shown here. But I wonder what thoughts you might have about what Nekisha and Jackie have created in response to Artemis Bast.
Well, I have to say that these incredible women seem to have sort of seem to be embodying rather than regurgitating anything that I've ever done. But it's obviously what's so thrilling, and I will look at my throat because it has gone through them and their whole lives, all their lives, stories, and my reference is just sort of something way in the background. It's just that, and who they are so, it's so, these two, the choices that made of these two fabulous artists is that, it's not just it's not a surface rendering of some of my ideas. It's like having sort of brought it into themselves, and it so it no longer has anything that directly to do with me. It's directly about them, but the fact that I feel such a familiarity and such a kind of so comfortable with their works is because it's it's just a real heartening that what I did had any bearing on what these fantastic women have done. I'm just very honored, really.
So we have time to just very few questions. And do we have someone going around with a mic? Yes, and a reminder that in the Fox Hall, there's going to be a reception, and the artists and Fred, they're all going to be there. So they're going to be whisked off the side of the stage when this is over, so that there won't be queues of people here to congratulate them and ask them questions. But they will be at the reception, so you will have a chance to do that. But just a couple of questions, burning questions that you want answered in full public. And actually, are there any students in the audience? I always like to take a student. I'm an educator. Students or artists who have questions. We have somebody up there in the gallery. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your wonderful work. I guess my question is how, when we're interrogating the problems with art infrastructure through art, what are the limitations with that practice? And is there strategy or work around or against or sidelong to that process? Or are we just fighting art from thousands of years ago with art from today?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by art infrastructure. You're talking about museums? So our museums, do they stand in the way? Do they stand in the way of the creation of the artists, or are they obstacles to them dealing with creating work that's about the collision of history? Can we break down the kind of canon in the galleries? Yeah, okay, I get it. So the question, as I understand it, is this enfilade of galleries that you see in so many museums that tell history in a very linear and particular way. We can see it as an obstacle in your work, in the artist's work, or we can see it as an opportunity. Which is it for you? Obstacle or opportunity? And are museums becoming, are they cooperating? Nekisha? Is it on? Nekisha? They didn't know when they brought me in I was also a comedy routine.
I don't know. See, now they gave me a new mic, and now I'm like, did anybody hear what I was saying earlier? I don't know.
Oh, this is a great question.
I think this, what's happening here is that when museums are doing the right thing, it is it's an invitation. It's an opportunity. I think that this is happening more and more, and faster, very fast. I think and Fred, maybe you can speak more about that, but I remember you saying just how quickly things have evolved. I worked in a museum for 10 years, and for those 10 years that I was at this museum, everything sort of stayed the same. And I went back, I did a project with this museum a few years after I left, and I came back, and those offices were filled with people who looked like me, and it was wild that it happened so fast.
So you can't change the story until you change who tells the story.
Mm-hmm. No, you go ahead. I have lots of opinions about that.
Well, I like to say, that good ideas travel really far, and if you let them in, and I think one could see how, after the Mining Museum opened for the American Association
Museums Conference.
Museums Conference, it was kind of a really watershed moment for me, but really for the museum community, because there was just nothing they ever seen before, never thought about, and it was from then, as far as I know, as working in museums, the mirror was returned back on themselves, and they couldn't not talk about things, not see things anymore, because that was an exhibition that I did really spoke the language of museum. It was speaking to them. They may not have understood, how it happened. In fact, at the Historical Society, really the guards, the food service people, the lady in the gift shop understood the exhibition far deeper than any of the professional staff, and they knew it. And for that period of time, the power structure just flipped for the whole duration of the exhibition. And I think that was and then for the AM, that was a profound experience for them too, in that same way, as if they were in their own museums, and the marginal became the center, because one could not shake the reality of what was going on before that.
And what had been erased and suppressed
Yeah.
could no longer be unseen.
Yeah. I mean, it took,
Yeah.
a long time for it to really shift, and I think in many different fields, what happened to George Floyd was just the last straw. And it's not only for African Americans, but for everyone. A large majority of the population saw, well, what am I doing what am I not seeing? And since I'm, especially in museums, you're there to project this, your knowledge and your experience and histories to the population. You have a responsibility, different from average folks who are coming to see an exhibition. You have a responsibility, and so they no longer could hide behind their scholarship that wasn't teaching anything to them, leaving out whole histories. So I think it was a combination of situations that really got the ball rolling, as it were, and everybody wanted their black curator, but it took a while for them to kind of actually do what they were saying they would do.
Yeah, well, we're the 40,000-pound gorilla, and we move a half inch, and we think we've moved the earth, heaven and earth. And institutions move glacially.
Yes.
And artists are there to nudge us forward so that we must move forward. I think that's one of the important things that artists like you all have done. Jackie, I know that you wanted to add something to this discussion, because museums have been very important to you. We're gonna wrap up in just a minute, but I really wanted to give you an opportunity to add your thoughts.
Sure, I think that's a really excellent question that you put forth, and I honestly I don't know even where to begin with that. I think it's still in progress. Like, this idea is just starting to, in my mind, it's just at the beginning stages of development in terms of critique of museum and the museum responding, and all of these things are so fresh. I think that there's going to be, and there's going to be a lot of mistakes, obviously. I think, but anyway, I'm not going to go too deep, because I feel like so much has been answered to that question. But
what this project by the BMA teaches us is that we as museum colleagues can't do this alone, which is why the group of community jurists who chose the work was so critical, that we have to be drawing together diverse perspectives and ways of knowing that come from outside the museum, and be in good relation with those ways of knowing and keep drawing them in, because we can only make these the disruptions of the narratives of history that you've all described together. We have to disrupt, and the healing can only happen if we do it together, because those histories, just thinking about the treatment of human remains from Egypt, and the way the
shabtai, the little objects that were buried with them, that the human remains were thrown over, but those little amulets were kept and treated just like souvenirs instead of sacred burial objects, is an example. Harm. There's been harm done to native communities where human remains and objects from burials have been kept in museums for several hundred years. And in order to do the repair, we have to be in good relation to the very many communities who have their histories at stake in the work that we do. And I think artists have been extremely effective in helping point the way to that, as all of you have. So,
well, one thing that that I said earlier about my experience of going to museums as a child and not feeling that connection, I think that's where that should not be happening, right? Like, I think that a child going into a museum today should, you know, who maybe, let's use an Egyptian child as an example, should have a relationship to this heritage, and so that, I think that puts some work in the hands of the museum workers. And
well, sadly, I know that my colleagues at the BMA are going to not be very happy with me if I don't also respect the care that went into preparing to honor the artists in the reception. I want to just take a moment to thank Tracy Beal and her team. Tracy's the head of public programs. Tracy's a force of nature. She gathered us together on numerous occasions so that we could all learn from each other, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm sorry to bring this to an immediate close, but we'll look forward to seeing you in the reception hall. Please join us. I think it'll be a really lovely celebration. Thank you for coming.